If we're going to talk about protesting in late stage capitalism, we have to talk about disabled people and how they protest. And I know a lot of you love to ignore disabled people when it comes to any sort of movement work. But disabled people have been getting things going for literal decades. And it's important to know how disability politics inform how we move through late stage capitalism. Because late stage capitalism is disabling people. Not only are millions more disabled because of COVID, but technology like AI threatens to take thousands, if not millions of people out of the workforce, even with the ruling that AI works cannot be copyrighted. So let's do a little bit of an appreciative inquiry about disability protest and how it works. An appreciative inquiry is an organizational tool whereby people look at what works for an organization. And I think we need to be doing this across the board with protests and organizing, particularly because protests in our modern age may look different from what we know historically. So the more we understand what works, the more we can adapt it for our current era. And disabled people are an incredibly important group to study in late stage capitalism because we are seen as profit centers, not profit makers. We are seen as people that take capital to survive, but do not produce any capital, which is the exact situation that capitalism wants to put everybody in. An incredible resource for everybody to have is Temple University's Disability Center. They go over the history of disability politics and where we are right now. And they also have an assistive technology center too that helps you explore your accessibility, which just in general, as a side note, I just think is really cool. It is going to be their disability timeline that I use in this video. Firstly, it's important to note something called the ugly laws. You've heard me talk about it on this channel before, but ugly laws are public ordinances that made it illegal for disabled people to be in public. And these took place from the 1860s until 1974. This is important because by the time the civil rights movement started, it was still illegal in many places for disabled people to be in public. And even if these ordinances were not enforced, the history of institutionalization meant that disabled people in the public sphere still was not really a thing. So disability being out in public and wanting to integrate into society in and of itself was considered advocacy. Now, before I go over some of the tactics, it must be noted that a lot of these tactics are borrowed from the civil rights movement because they were all happening at the exact same time. Our modern understanding of the disability rights movement starts with the independent living movement. In the early 1960s, Ed Roberts, a man with polio, enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley. After his admission is rejected, he fights to get the decision overturned. His advocacy, along with that of Judy Heumann, inspires the independent living movement and helps establish the first Center for Independent Living. Centers for Independent Living exist still today, and they still do advocacy work on behalf of disabled people. But it's important to note here that it started in like a small group in Berkeley, California. And a lot of organizing around disability advocacy at the time happened in that area. It is additionally important to note that Ed Roberts was somebody with polio. Polio is an illness, which means that he wasn't born with his disability. So the public perception of him is that he was somebody who was quote unquote normal, who then befell into disability and now is facing discrimination. There's very much so a fear of abled individuals. Then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act passes, except it does not include disabled people. Which, when you think about how racism is disabling and how people who are marginalized have the highest rates of disability, is very shady. But just because the Civil Rights Bill passes without any provisions for disabled people does not mean that civil rights activists are not paying attention to the disability rights movement. Now, in 1974, the last of the ugly laws is repealed in Chicago. The 70s were a huge time for the public awareness of disability rights, and are part of the only reason that disabled people exist in public spaces today. Now, back when Geraldo Rivera was doing actual journalism, he visited an institution called Willowbrook. And massive trigger warnings if you go to look for this. It's very devastating what happened to disabled people in these institutions. But to say the very, 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 very least, it was horrific. But it was the reporting of this that led to the Protection and Advocacy Network that exists today, which investigates the abuse and neglect of disabled people in such institutions. And with the start of this network, the government promised to reduce the number of disabled people in institutions to 0. That still has not yet happened because we don't fully fund something called home and community-based services, but that's for a later date. It's important to note that while a lot of these services were being put into place, in their at least initial stages, a lot of them did not take a lot of input from disabled people themselves. In 1973, a man by the name of Brad Lomax moved to the Bay Area around Berkeley, California. Brad Lomax was a member of the Black Panther Party and been doing organizing with them, but then was diagnosed with MS and wanted to move to an area where disability rights were happening. So Brad Lomax kind of bridged the gap between the civil rights movement for African Americans and the disability rights movement. And this is important to note because the Black Panthers helped coordinate and provide support to the 504 sit-ins, where disabled people occupied a federal office building. Again, this is cross-movement collaboration that we're seeing here. This is a tactic directly taken from the civil rights movement. which shows us just how important partnership and collaboration really is. And cross-movement solidarity is one of the most important aspects to disability advocacy that we see today. When the opposition had cut off water and supplies, the Black Panthers forced their way into the building that the 504 sit-in people were occupying and gave food and supplies to everyone. And that's because they had an existing network of support that was built up prior to this action. Another really cool aspect is how some disabled people during the 504 sit-ins used their disabilities to their advantage. The authorities had cut off communication between the protesters and the outside world. So deaf people became code breakers, signing messages outside of the windows to relay messages to other people on the ground. Like, come on! We see another manifestation of this in Denver, Colorado, as disabled people protest inaccessibility in transit. And with the rise of the protest group, National Adapt. They're still around and do protests outside of transportation to this day. But in 1980, they used being disabled to halt the transportation system in Denver, Colorado. These people got out of their wheelchairs, away from their mobility aids, and laid in front of buses, halting the transportation system. What do you mean? I can't get up. I can't move. Some folks stayed in their wheelchairs too, but the point was made. And all of this drew a lot of press and created a lot of shame for governments. And shaming people is a major aspect to disability protest, particularly when it comes to the Capitol Crawl protest. This is one of the more famous disability protests that you see pictures of all the time. They were protesting the delay of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This took place in 1990 as disabled people wanted to ensure that they had access to public spaces. Again, we have moved from existing in public space as protest and wanting to be integrated in everyday aspects of life like education to actively using our presence in society to shame people that do not want to include disabled people in the public sphere. And again, all this took place in 1990. But the ADA was not the end-all be-all for disability rights. A lot of our rights had to be legislated within the court system. One of the most important court cases of my lifetime has been the Olmstead decision, which requires states to provide services in the most integrated setting and reinforce the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. In the late 1990s, Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson were two people who found themselves in and out of mental hospitals to treat mental health disabilities as well as intellectual disabilities. In one instance, they were not allowed to go back home, and essentially they were confined to live in the mental hospital. The judge ruled that this is essentially segregation from society, and that disabled people have the right to live in the community with services that meet their needs. And to this day, disabled people are still fighting to fully fund what is called home and community-based services. Lastly, let's talk about how disabled people saved the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid in 2017. Basically, Mitch McConnell had been stonewalling disability advocates to talk about the healthcare law, and so they staged a die-in at his office. The protester in the last section of that last clip was Stephanie Woodward, and her arrest led to this very, very, very iconic photo of her being handcuffed behind her wheelchair. This was all over the news at the time, and it was a bad fucking look for Mitch McConnell, but when does he have a good look? And again, this protest used the model of a sit-in, shame, and using disability to one's advantage. Anyways, that was a very, very brief history of disability protest. Let's all learn something from it.